I've addressed a couple of Scott M. Sullivan's quick tips on how to argue with an atheist, but there's quite a few of them, and they're relatively short, so I decided I should probably double up on them and make my responses a little more substantive. After all, why not? He's got comments turned off, so he won't even know we're over here talking about him. Therefore, let's look at quick tips 3 and 4 that have to do with scientism and false definitions of faith, respectively. This is going to hurt, I can tell already.
Hey guys, Scott Sullivan here with tip number 3 now on how to argue with an atheist. Okay, so quick tip number 3 now on how to argue with an atheist is to watch out for scientism. Scientism. That's the idea that the only thing that counts as knowledge are scientific truths, things that can be known by the scientific method. And this is a philosophical error, but it's assumed all the time by atheists. They just assume this. They'll say things like, well, you can't know that because it's not provable by science.
To start, scientism isn't a thing. It's an invented, nonsensical word created by the religious when they have to deal with science or the scientific method raining on their parade. There's no such thing as scientism. But he then goes on to say that atheists say that anything not testable by science is irrelevant. And I would say that it isn't science, it's the scientific method that matters. This is where religion falls apart. It simply is not a rational way of looking at the world. It's made up of assertions and claims that cannot be justified or rationalized using objective evidence. The existence of gods is no more demonstrable than the existence of fairies. If we should not accept fairies as an explanation for unexplained phenomena, why should we accept gods? Yet, that's exactly why apologists make up nonsense like scientism. They want to discredit critical thinking and rational evaluation that would drive any intellectual individual to reject the empty and unsupported claims of gods. It's not an unrealistic bias towards nature. It's a wholly realistic bias towards reality. And whether Sullivan likes it or not, his religious beliefs just don't fit.
Again, this is a philosophical error. There are actually 2 problems with scientism. First of all, the idea itself is completely self-refuting. That is to say, it commits a kind of intellectual suicide. In other words, the statement, the only things that we can know must be proven by science, that statement itself can't be proven by science, so it doesn't even own up to its own standard.
Except that's a standard that's been made up entirely by the apologist. You will never find any scientist anywhere saying what Sullivan has said here. What scientists will tell you, particularly philosophers of science, is that the scientific method is the only method that we currently know of which can bring us closer to an objective understanding of the universe. It has a strict methodology and procedure that allows testing by multiple parties that sort out intellectual and emotional bias from the experiments and produces both falsifiable results and results that make testable predictions. Religion cannot do that. Religion is riddled with emotional biases and wishful thinking. It cannot produce any objective evidence for any of the claims, and the predictions it makes are neither testable nor falsifiable. In short, we are using the only system we know works, and theists, because their claims fail miserably when using this system, well, they just want to insert their own entirely undefined and untested system, a system that every time it is tested, it fails miserably, because otherwise their ideas have no chance in hell.
Now, the second problem with scientism is that there are clear counterexamples. There are instances of knowledge that we all have, reasonable beliefs that we all have, that do not come from the scientific method. Things like the laws of logic and mathematics. So statements like, every triangle has 3 sides. Every triangle, even the ones we haven't observed yet. That can't be proven by the scientific method. Or things like moral truths, like it's wrong to kidnap young women and sell them as slaves. That can't be scientifically proven either. So there are clear counterexamples to this restricted notion that the only things that we can know come from science.
Of course, he continues to pull this shit straight out of his ass because his 2 examples are laughably false. First off, the scientific method, which is really what's being talked about here, even if he isn't aware of it, is a philosophical methodology. It is a way of looking at evidence intellectually and rationally to see if it fits the observations. In fact, his idea that we can never know that all triangles have three sides because we haven't observed all of them is utterly laughable. All triangles, by definition, have three sides. Any figure that has more than three sides is, by definition, not a triangle. We don't have to examine them all because humans invented the terminology involved. Secondly, he claims that we can't learn about morality from science, and then gives the example of selling women into slavery. He's trying to make the case that his own religious views are somehow more moral than scientific views, but apparently he hasn't read his own Bible. The Bible makes it quite clear about slavery, how to buy slaves, how to treat slaves, how to sell slaves to your neighbors, etc. In Exodus 21, it talks about having to free Jewish slaves after 7 years and forgive their debts. But in verse 7, it states that if you sell your daughter into slavery, she is not to be freed after 7 years. She is a slave for life. Wow, that Bible is such a moral book, right? That was the end of his third tip. But I did cut out his begging for subscriptions and his book sales. I've pointed that out in a couple of other videos, and we all know it's ridiculous, so let's not do that again. I'm also cutting out his intro to the second quick tip. We've already seen it once, and there's no need to be repetitious. So let's get on to his fourth quick tip for arguing with atheists.
All right, now, so quick tip number 4 now on how to argue with an atheist is to watch out for a false definition of faith. Watch out for this. I guarantee you it's going to come up. You'll be in a discussion with an atheist, and they'll say something like, faith by definition is believing in things without evidence. You have to reject this. Do not accept this. This is a false notion of faith. It's a straw man definition. It is completely wrong, and there's no reason a Christian needs to accept that.
Yes, it is true that you will find false definitions of faith cropping up in any debate with a theist, but it isn't going to be coming from the atheist. The atheist isn't causing the problem. It's going to be the theist in virtually all cases. So let's go straight to the dictionary, shall we? The definition of faith is strong belief in God or in the doctrines of a religion based on spiritual apprehension rather than proof. This is not a false definition. This is the definition of the word. Of course, theists hate this definition because it's rational and their faith is irrational. There's no way to objectively examine the belief and faith of a theist to see if it is well-founded in logic or reason. While apologists are aware of this utter failure of their faith, they are absolutely terrified to acknowledge it, especially to the young faithful.
The classic understanding of Christian faith is that faith is a divine virtue by which we believe those things that God has revealed.
And how do you know that God has revealed anything? How do you know that God exists in the first place? How do you get to those ideas critically and rationally? Well, by faith, of course, but faith is not anything like what he claims it is. If this was a reasonable position to take, you could step back and ask the believer how they know that God is real and expect objective evidence to support such a contention. In the absence of such, there's no reason to believe that God actually exists, any more than we ought to believe in the Loch Ness Monster because someone claims they saw something out on the loch. It requires more than personal conviction to demonstrate something is actually so. But Sullivan is aware of this problem, and he tries to address it, but fails miserably.
Now, someone may want to know, well, how do you know God revealed anything at all? How do you know that God has spoken in the first place? And that's a very good question. And the answer is the evidence. The evidence is the means by which we know God has spoken. In theology, we call these the motives of credibility, things like miracles and prophecy. These are the kinds of things that by which we know that revelation has occurred in the first place, and then we can make an intellectually responsible act of faith based upon that. So please, reject this false notion of faith that atheists want to throw around all the time. This is wrong. This is not the Christian understanding, and you have to be aware of this.
Well, as I said, he tries to address it and fails because he neither presents any evidence for the existence of God, nor does he show that there are any actual prophecies that support it. I know this is supposed to be a quick tip, but if he's just going to make unsupported assertions and pretend that they're true, that pretty much means everything else he says is pointless. So let's look at this for a second. He claims that there's evidence for the existence of God. Where? Now, before he starts throwing around philosophical claims, all of which have been soundly disproven, let's accept for a moment that something like the Kalam cosmological argument is actually valid. It's not. It is complete bullshit, but let's pretend. Even if he did show that a God is the most likely solution, that doesn't prove that said God is the Christian version. In fact, there are many thousands of gods that have been invented by man to worship over the years, not to mention the almost limitless number of possible gods that man has never even dreamed up. The odds that this is going to be his specific deity, worshipped by the Christians, is somewhere between slim and none. No arguments have been proposed that would take those additional steps between maybe there's a God and it has to be this particular God. Outside of I hear voices in my head, I've yet to see any apologist give me solid, objective evidence that the God they worship is at all supported credibly. It's just skipping down the primrose path of irrational logic into wishful thinking land, and that's just not rational. Sullivan wants us to use logic, remember? Secondly, while there are lots of claimed prophecies in the Bible, absolutely none of them stand up under any critical scrutiny. They're all vague. None of them can be shown to refer to a single event, provided in exacting detail, and demonstrably made before the fact. Add to that the fact that lots of religions claim to have prophecies, all with the same degree of vagaries. So why do the poor biblical prophecies mean something, while the other religions' poor prophecies do not? That's not logical. None of the things that Sullivan says are. His ideas for arguing with atheists only reveal his own ignorance and laughably blind faith. It's not something to be proud of. It's something he should be ashamed of. And that's why people point and laugh. Well, 2 more quick tips in the can. At the moment, Sullivan has 9 of these quick tips out, and I'll be taking them on 2 at a time. I can only imagine what lies in wait for next time. I really hope that anyone who takes the time to listen to my videos is realizing just how absurd these apologists really are, and that especially goes for theists. It doesn't matter how strong your faith is. If you're unwilling and incapable of stepping back and examining your own beliefs rationally or caring whether these things really are true or false, regardless of your emotional attachment, then you've got some issues and need either some professional counseling or a basic education. Throwing around Bible verses isn't going to impress anyone. You have to actually be able to back up your claims with some solid, objective evidence and logically valid reasoning. When you realize that you have neither of those, maybe it's time to consider whether you ought to be holding these beliefs in the first place. Thanks once again for sticking around. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share the videos, and direct any comments, questions, or constructive criticisms below. Make sure you sharpen your logical spears, because the world is full of uncritical, irrational beliefs that have no problem harming you unless you have some means of beating them back. Until next time, happy hunting.